The stovepipe fell on the second day of January, not dramatically, not with the violence of a structure failing under stress. It simply separated at the lower joint, the cast-iron collar that connected the pipe to the stove body, cracking along a seam that had been developing since November, a thin line of rust stress that the January cold had finished what the autumn moisture had started. The pipe separated and tilted, and the smoke that had been going up and out went sideways and down, and Britta Mäkinen had approximately 4 seconds to understand what was happening before the smoke filled the cabin. She pulled the draft closed on the stove body and went outside with her eyes streaming, and stood in the Wyoming territory, cold at 6 in the morning, and looked at the sky, which was the particular hard-edged sky of a January cold front. No clouds, no wind. The stillness that in Wyoming meant the temperature was about to do something serious. The thermometer her husband Paavo had hung on the east porch post in their first summer read -31. She went back inside, waving the smoke out, and looked at the stove. The cast-iron collar was cracked through, not just cracked but separated, a gap she could see daylight through in the place where the pipe met the body. She could reattach the pipe with the collar broken, but the broken collar would not hold the joint, and a joint that did not hold was a chimney that leaked smoke into the cabin, and a chimney fire risk that was not theoretical. She needed a new collar. The nearest place to buy a cast-iron stove collar was the Laramie Creek Trading Post, 14 miles west on the Valley Road. In July, 14 miles was an hour's ride. In January, with a cold front settling in, 14 miles was not a ride she was taking. Not alone. Not without knowing what the temperature intended to do. She stood in the smokeless cabin and looked at the stove and looked at the thermometer through the window, which now read -33, and understood the situation. No stove, no collar, no ride to Laramie Creek, -33 and falling. She sat down in the chair by the cold stove and thought, the way her father had always told her to think before moving. Sit first, think second, act third. He had told her this in Finnish, which was the language of the thinking she did when things were serious, and she thought it in Finnish now, sitting in the cold cabin with the smoke clearing from the rafters and the thermometer dropping. She had a fireplace. The fireplace was in the east wall, the original heat source of the cabin when Paavo had built it in 1864, before he added the iron stove in 1866 as an improvement because the iron stove was more efficient and held heat longer than the open fire. The fireplace had been the backup since 1866, used occasionally for the specific pleasure of an open fire, mostly not. It worked. The chimney was sound. She had cleaned it in September. She could heat the cabin with the fireplace. But here was the thing about the fireplace. The thing she had always known, but had not needed to think about carefully until now. The fireplace heated the cabin the way a leaking bucket held water. The original cabin chinking, the dried grass and clay mix that Paavo had packed between the logs in 1864, had been adequate in 1864 when it was fresh set and tight. In 1869, 5 years of Wyoming freeze-thaw and summer heat had contracted and cracked the chinking in 100 places. Small gaps, no single gap large enough to be alarming, but collectively a surface area of open-air passage that she had been compensating for with the iron stove's superior heat output for 3 years, without quite acknowledging the compensation. The iron stove was strong enough to heat a leaking cabin. The fireplace was not. Or rather, the fireplace was not strong enough to heat a leaking cabin at -33. The fireplace was plenty strong enough to heat a sealed one. She was a Finnish woman, and she knew about clay. Her father had worked the Finnish clay beds in Karelia, not as a potter, but as a practical man who used clay for everything that needed to be sealed or shaped or made to stay where it was put. He had chinked his own house with river clay and had told her that river clay was better than bank clay for chinking, because the river tumbled out the stones and left the fine particles, the ones that went into the cracks and filled them, and when they dried, made a surface harder than the material on either side. There was river clay in the Laramie Creek tributary that ran through the eastern edge of the property. She had known this since the first summer, because the clay bank was visible from the north field, a pale grey exposure in the creek bank where the water had cut through the topsoil into the clay below. The kind of clay exposure that made her think of her father's house every time she saw it. She had never used the clay for anything. There had always been other things, and the original chinking had been good enough when combined with the stove's output. There was no other thing now. She assessed the situation in Finnish. She was alone on the claim, which she had been since August, when her brother-in-law Erkki Mäkinen had come from the Finnish settlement in Nebraska in the aftermath of Paavo's death, and had told her what she was going to do. Erkki was 44, and he had a claim in Nebraska that was producing adequately, and a wife and 4 children, and the specific confidence of a man who had been managing things for other people for his entire adult life. He had told her she was coming to Nebraska. He had said the Wyoming claim was too much for one person. He had said Paavo would have wanted her provided for. She had told Erkki that she was staying. He had looked at her for a long time, and then he had said things that were not kind, and then he had ridden back to Nebraska and sent 2 letters in the autumn that she had read and filed and not answered, because answering required energy she was spending on the claim. She was alone on the claim. The nearest neighbor was Otto Hess, a German from Baden who had come to Wyoming in 1866 with his wife Margaret and 2 grown sons. Otto's claim was 3 miles east. He was a reliable man in the specific way of German farmers who had been building their reliability for 30 years before leaving Germany, the reliability that was structural rather than occasional. She could have ridden to Otto's claim. She had the horse. She could not dig clay in January on her own from a frozen creek bank without tools she did not have, and return in the cold with enough clay to do the work before the cold became dangerous. She had 4 hours of reasonable outdoor working temperature in a Wyoming January, before the cold started making decisions for her body that her body had not agreed to. Riding to Otto's and explaining the situation and riding back was 2 hours minimum. She had 2 hours, not 4. She sat in the chair and thought about this. She had clay. She had the clay she had been collecting since October, not for chinking. She had been collecting it for the garden project she had been planning since September, the raised bed she intended to build on the south side of the cabin in the spring. Clay-lined walls to hold the moisture in the dry Wyoming summer. She had 4 buckets of river clay under the workbench, collected on 4 different October trips to the creek bank, each bucket covered with a piece of canvas to keep it workable through the early winter. 4 buckets of river clay. She went and lifted the canvas on the first bucket and pressed her thumb into the clay. Still workable, not frozen. Under the canvas, in the shelter of the cabin floor, the clay had stayed soft. She looked at the cabin walls, not the interior surface. The log faces themselves, the chinking gaps between the courses, the places where the dried original chinking had shrunk and cracked. She went to the north wall, which was the wall that took the wind, and which was therefore the wall that showed the chinking failures most clearly, and she pressed her eye to the most obvious gap, a crack perhaps 1/16 of an inch wide and 2 inches long at the 3rd course from the floor. Through the crack, she could see outside. 1/16 of an inch of Wyoming January coming through that single crack at the velocity of the temperature differential, which was the velocity of cold moving toward heat, which was relentless and fast. She pressed her eye to the crack and felt the cold air moving against her eyeball, and then she stood up and counted the visible chinking failures on the north wall alone. 31. She went to the south wall. 19. East wall, 12. West wall, 24. 86 visible chinking failures. She knew there were more she could not see from inside, gaps that had opened toward the exterior that had not yet fully penetrated the chinking depth. She did not feel hopeless about this number. She felt clear about it. 86 was a specific number, and specific numbers were manageable in a way that general problems were not. She was going to press clay into 86 gaps, plus however many more she found on close inspection, and she was going to do it today, and then she was going to light the fireplace and heat the sealed cabin with the fireplace, and she was going to be warm. She got up and put on her second coat over her first coat, and her wool hat over her linen cap, and her heavy mittens, and went outside. The cold hit her with the focus of something that had been waiting. She did not run. Running in that cold was how you breathed ice into your lungs, which was how you coughed through February and possibly didn't stop. She walked to the creek bank at a pace that kept her warm enough to function and not fast enough to force the cold air deeper than her throat. The creek was frozen. She had known it would be. The clay bank was exposed above the ice, the pale grey face of it visible in the pale January light, and she worked it with the short spade she had brought, driving the blade into the bank and pulling clay free in chunks, loading the canvas sack she had slung over her shoulder. The clay was cold at the surface and less cold below. She dug 3 inches deep before the clay was workable in temperature, the cold receding into the bank the same way it receded everywhere, slowly, grudgingly, only as deep as the cold could reach before the earth's own temperature pushed back. She filled the sack to 30 pounds and stopped. 30 pounds was what she could carry at a useful pace. She needed to make this trip efficient. She walked back to the cabin. She moved with purpose, not rushed, not anxious. She had been on the Wyoming claim alone for 7 months, and she had learned what lone management of a claim required, which was the elimination of the panic state that consumed energy and the substitution of the assessment state that generated solutions. She had learned this from Paavo, who had been a deliberate man, and from her father before Paavo, who had been even more deliberate because her father had been working clay banks since he was 8 years old, and deliberate people worked clay banks, and reckless people did not. She went inside and set the sack down and took off the outer coat and began. The method was simple, and her father had shown it to her when she was 12. You worked the clay with your thumbs, pressing it into the gap, filling from the deepest point outward, packing it tight, smoothing the surface with a wet finger to close the surface pores and help it set hard. You did not need tools for this. You needed thumbs and patience and enough clay, and she had all 3. She started on the north wall, which was the priority. Gap 1, 3rd course from floor. Thumb into the clay, push deep, pack tight, smooth. 15 seconds. Gap 2, 5th course. Same. 15 seconds. She worked steadily, the way her father had worked, the way all work that required sustained effort rather than bursts was best worked. At the rate that could be maintained rather than the rate that made you feel productive for 20 minutes before you stopped. She worked at the rate of a woman who understood that the north wall was 31 gaps and the south wall was 19 and the east and west walls were another 36 between them, and she had enough clay in the sack for the north wall and the beginning of the south, and she needed to go back to the creek for more. The fireplace was cold. She did not light it yet. She did not want the draw of a fire pulling cold air through the gaps she had not yet sealed. She would seal every gap she could find first. Then she would light the fireplace. She finished the north wall in 40 minutes. 31 gaps, now sealed. The pale grey clay wet dark in each joint, filling the cracks that had been admitting 31 threads of Wyoming January for the past several winters. She pressed her hand to each sealed joint as she finished it, not measuring temperature, just confirming the absence of airflow, the seal of clay over the gap. She went back to the creek for more clay. The temperature on the porch thermometer as she passed it read -37. She made 3 more trips to the creek bank. On the second trip, she filled the sack to 40 pounds, which was more than she could maintain at pace, but which she managed because the north wall was done and the south wall was sealed, and she was in the specific physical state of someone who was doing the thing and had not yet done enough of it to stop. On the third trip, she brought back the 4 garden buckets from under the workbench, all of them, adding their soft stored clay to the creek clay she had been loading. The east and west walls took the afternoon. She found more gaps than the initial count. The close inspection revealed cracks she had not seen from the center of the room. Gaps at the corners where the chinking had shrunk and pulled away from the log ends. Gaps at the window frames where the frame had settled slightly over 5 years and opened a seam between the frame timber and the log course above it. She sealed them all. She was working by lantern light when she finished the west wall at 4 in the afternoon. The January dark, coming early and fast, the thermometer outside a number she did not go out to read because she already knew the number was not improving. She lit the fireplace. The first fire since she had used it casually in October, a demonstration fire for no audience, a fire because she had wanted one on a cold evening before the stove was needed. She had a full wood box and more wood stacked in the covered shelter against the east wall, enough for 3 weeks of fireplace use if she was careful, and the cold did not run longer than 3 weeks. She lit the fire and sat back from it and looked at the cabin. The cabin was sealed, every gap she had found, and more that she had found by running her wet hand along the chinking lines and feeling the cold air on the back of her hand where the clay was not yet fully in. Those two. A wet hand was a better instrument for finding drafts than eyes were. She had finished every surface she could find. The fire caught and built. The drawer was good, the chimney clear, the smoke going up and out the way it was meant to. She waited. In an unsealed cabin, the heat from a fireplace left the room almost as fast as it was produced, drawn out through every gap by the temperature differential. The fireplace worked hard, and the cabin stayed cold because the cabin was always in equilibrium with the outside, always losing what the fire put in through the 100 small exits the chinking failures provided. In a sealed cabin, the heat had nowhere to go. She watched the thermometer she kept inside, a small mercury instrument on the shelf above the writing table. She had been watching it drop all day as the stove went cold and the cabin temperature fell toward the outside. At noon it had read 41. At 2 it had read 38. When she lit the fireplace at 4 it read 35. At 5 it read 40. At 6 it read 48. At 7 it read 54. She sat in the chair with her second coat off and her hat on her knee, and watched the mercury climb and thought about the north wall of the cabin, the 31 sealed gaps now curing in the clay, the invisible surface she had built between the inside and the outside that the cold had been using for 5 years, and that now it could not use. The cabin was not leaking. The fire was not fighting the outside. The fire was heating the inside. This was what a sealed cabin did, and what a leaking cabin could not. It kept the heat that was produced inside the inside. She had known this in principle. Everyone who had ever stood in a drafty cabin in January and fed a fire that seemed to produce no effect on the temperature had known it in principle. The principle was obvious. The application required clay and time and a stovepipe collar that had the grace to fail on a day when she was home and paying attention. She made supper over the fireplace, a thing she had not done since 1866, and ate at the table with the temperature at 58 degrees, and the outside at whatever it was, and the mercury still climbing, slowly now, the rate of gain decreasing as the cabin temperature approached the equilibrium of the fire size. 62. She let the fire down to a maintenance level at 9 and watched the temperature. At midnight it was 59. The fire at maintenance, the sealed cabin holding 3 degrees of loss in 3 hours. She built the fire up slightly. She went to sleep. In the night, the cold front settled over the Wyoming territory with the specific intention of the worst cold in 6 years. She did not know this yet. She slept. The cabin temperature at 4 in the morning was 53 by the thermometer she checked when she woke to add wood. Outside, the thermometer she could see through the window from the wood box read what it read, and she stood at the window in the dark with the lantern and looked at the thermometer through the glass and then looked again. -45. She stood at the window for a moment and looked at the number and then looked at the fire, which she had just built up, and then looked at the interior thermometer, which read 53. -45 outside, 53 inside. She sat down in the chair and did the subtraction. 98 degrees of difference. The cabin wall, the log wall with its sealed clay chinking, was holding 98 degrees of temperature difference between the inside and the outside. She thought about the north wall with its 31 sealed gaps. She thought about her father's house in Karelia with its clay-chinked walls that her father had told her were tighter than anything because the river clay filled finer than the bank clay, and when it set like stone. She thought about the fireplace, which was a modest fire, a fire she would not have described as sufficient for a Wyoming January in an unsealed cabin, and which was maintaining 53 degrees against a 45 below outside. She built the fire up to a working burn and watched the temperature climb, and was at 61 degrees by 6 in the morning when the first light came grey through the east window. The second day she worked. There was always work on a claim in January. The work that did not stop because the weather was serious. The animals to tend, the water to carry from the creek hole she had kept open with the axe through November and December. The daily management of a working farm that Erkki Mäkinen had told her in August was too much for one person. She did the water first because the water was the non-negotiable. The cattle needed water even at -45, and the hole in the creek ice that she had been maintaining since November was going to be skinned over from the night, which it was, and she broke the skin ice with the spud bar and hauled 2 buckets back to the barn at the pace that kept her functional without forcing the cold air into her lungs at a rate her body could not warm before it reached her chest. The cattle were fine. Pressed together in the barn center, their combined body heat maintaining the barn at something above 0, even at the worst of the cold. The shared warmth of 4 cattle being a significant thermal resource that she had thought about since October, when she had realized that the barn's heat budget was largely self-supplied, and her job was simply to maintain the structure that held it. The horse she checked and fed and spoke to in Finnish, which the horse did not understand but did not object to, and which she found useful in the way that speaking aloud was useful when there was no one else to speak to. It organized the thinking. She split the morning wood in the covered shelter, 10 minutes of work that was uncomfortable at the temperature and manageable at the pace she had learned. She had been splitting alone since April, and her arms had acquired the particular competence that came from doing a physical skill repeatedly without assistance, the economy of motion that was not strength, but was better than strength because it worked at any temperature. She came back inside, 61 degrees, the fireplace at its maintenance level, the sealed cabin holding what it had accumulated through the morning's work outside. She stood at the door for a moment, feeling the warmth come back into her face and hands, and thought about what a sealed wall actually was. A sealed wall was a membrane. It was the difference between inside and outside. A wall with gaps in it was not fully a membrane. It was a permeable surface, a suggestion of separation rather than a separation, and the cold that came through the gaps was not violating the wall, it was simply using the path the wall had provided. Seal the path, and the cold was outside where it belonged, looking at the wall, unable to find a way through. Her father had said, "A good wall does not fight the weather, it ignores it." She had been 8 years old. She had not understood the distinction between fighting and ignoring. She understood it now. She went outside with her layers and her purpose and did the necessary work and came back inside where it was 61 degrees and felt the warmth come back into her hands and thought about Erki. Erki had come in August with the confidence of a man who had a plan and with the expectation barely concealed that she would be relieved to have a plan offered. He had ridden 3 days from the Finnish settlement in Nebraska, which meant he had set out on the road before the burial letter had reached him, which meant he had set out at the news of Paavo's illness alone, and the timing of his arrival said something about how he had understood the situation before he arrived. He was 44 years old, Paavo's older brother, a wide man with Paavo's cheekbones and none of Paavo's patience, who had been managing things for his family since he was 16, and who had never found that the people on whose behalf he managed things were adequately grateful. Britta had always thought he was not wrong about this in principle. He was wrong about the specific application of the principle to her situation, which was a different thing. He had told her that the claim was too much for one person, which was true. He had told her that a woman alone in Wyoming was a danger to herself, which was partially true in the way that partial truths were the most effective arguments. He had told her that Paavo would have wanted her among the Finnish community in Nebraska, which was a statement she could neither confirm nor deny, and which she believed Erki believed, and which she also believed was not quite what Paavo would have wanted. What Paavo would have wanted was for her to be warm and working and not diminished. He had told her this in different words many times. He had married a Finnish woman from the clay country, specifically because Finnish women from the clay country were warm and working and not diminished, and he had spent 5 years being grateful for this. She did not need to speculate about what Paavo would have wanted. She had been there for the wanting. She had told Erki she was staying. He had said, "You cannot manage the claim alone." She had said, "I have been managing it since April." He died in April. He had said, "The summer is not the difficulty. The winter is the difficulty." She had looked at him and said, "I know about winter." There had been a silence. Erki was not a man who was easily silenced, but he was a man who was occasionally silenced, and this was one of those occasions. He had looked at her in the specific way of a person reassessing whether the directness they were facing was the directness of a stubborn person or the directness of a capable one. She had let him look. She was Finnish. She knew about winter in the way that people who had grown up in a country where winter was a serious structural feature of existence knew about winter, not as a thing to be feared, but as a thing to be prepared for, a thing with specific requirements that specific preparation met. She was 40 years old, and she had spent 40 winters in places where the cold was real, and she had been cold in those winters in the specific way of someone who understood that cold was a problem with solutions, and that the solutions required work, and the work required a person who was willing to do it. He had said after the silence, "You have 6 cord laid in for the winter." She had said yes. He had said, "That is adequate if the winter is not hard." She had said, "It is adequate if the cabin is sealed and the management is careful." She had paused. "I will seal the cabin in September and manage it carefully." He had looked at the cabin walls. He was a builder and a farmer, and he understood chinking, and he had looked at the original chinking with the eye of someone who was looking for the argument that would close the discussion. He had not found the argument. The chinking in August was visibly adequate. The cracks had not yet opened to the winter's worst. He had ridden back to Nebraska. He had sent 2 letters in autumn that she had read and filed, not because they were unimportant, but because answering them required energy she was spending on the claim, on the firewood and the root cellar and the cattle and the 100 other preparations that filled October and November. She was alone on the claim in January at -45. She was warm. She thought about this while she did the water carrying. She thought about it while she fed the cattle in the barn, which was warmer than the outside, but not warm, the cattle pressing against each other in the barn's thermal middle. She thought about it while she split the morning's wood in the covered shelter, the cold manageable at a working pace, the axe doing what an axe did. She went back inside. 61 degrees. The second night the temperature dropped to -48. She knew this because she looked at the porch thermometer before the dark came fully down and saw the mercury at the bottom of the useful range of the instrument and understood that -48 was either the number or close to it. She did not stand outside long enough to be certain. Certainty was less important than warmth. She built the fire for the night with the calculation she had developed over 2 days. A larger burn for 2 hours before bed, building the cabin to 64 or 65, then banking for the overnight maintenance, the coals keeping the sealed cabin above 50 through the coldest hours. She slept at 64 degrees. She woke at 4 with the cabin at 51, and the fire coals giving their last, and built it up and lay back and listened to the cabin. A sealed cabin in a cold night made sounds. The logs contracted. The clay in the chinking cracks made small settling sounds as it continued to cure. The fireplace made its own sounds. She had been a farmer's wife for 5 years, and she knew the sounds of the cabin, and the sounds outside the cabin, and the sounds that meant something was wrong. None of the sounds she was hearing meant something was wrong. The cattle were in the barn, the horse was in the barn, the hay was under the roof. The water bucket was inside, not frozen. She was warm. On the third morning, Otto Hess came. He came from the east at 8 in the morning, his horse moving at the walk that was the only pace in a -40 Wyoming morning, his breath and the horse's breath making paired clouds in the still air. She saw him from the east window when he was still half a mile out, the figure on horseback coming down the valley road, and she knew it was Otto by his horse, and by the way he sat, the particular upright posture of a man who had decided something and was acting on the decision. She put the coffee on. He knocked, and she opened the door, and he came in, pulling his scarf down from his face, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the cabin and at her, and at the thermometer on the shelf that read 60 degrees. He said, "You are alive." She said, "Yes." He said, "The stovepipe." She said, "Yes." January 2nd. He looked at the fireplace, the modest fire in it. He looked at the walls. He stepped to the north wall and pressed his hand to the chinking and felt the clay, which was cured now, hard and grey. He pressed his finger into it and it did not yield. He said, "You re-chinked." She said, "I re-chinked." "Coffee?" He sat down. He was 52 years old, and he had been farming in Germany and then Wisconsin and then Wyoming for 30 years. And he had a face that had been reorganized by those 30 years into an expression of careful reserve, a face that did not give information away before it was ready to give it. He took the coffee. He said, "How long since the pipe failed?" She said, "January 2nd, 3 days. He said, "Margaret said I should have come on the 2nd. She said, I was working on the 2nd. I would have told you to go home." He said nothing for a moment. He pressed his hand to the north wall again, to the sealed chinking joints, the row of grey clay she had pressed in with her thumbs. He said, "How warm?" She said, 53 when it was -45. 60 when the fire runs a morning burn. He said, "In a Wyoming January with no stove." She said, "With the fireplace. It is sufficient if the cabin is sealed." He said, "It was not sealed before." She said, "The original chinking was 5 years old." He said, "Mine also." She said nothing. She drank her coffee. He said, "I have been burning 12 cord a winter since we came." She said, "How many cord this year?" He said, 9 remaining after November and December. She was quiet. She thought about the north wall and the 31 sealed gaps, and what 31 sealed gaps meant for a fire's efficiency. She said, "How tight is your chinking?" He looked at her. He said, "I don't know." I have not looked at it the way I am looking at yours. She said, go home and look at it. She paused. Look on the north wall first, at the third and fifth courses from the floor, where the shrinkage is worst. Put your eye to the gaps you find, and see if you can see daylight. He said, if I can see daylight. She said, you are heating the outside. She said it directly, the Finnish way, because there was no useful way to say it sideways. You are feeding a fire that is heating the Wyoming territory, not your cabin. She paused. Re-chink with river clay. The tributary bank below the North Field has good clay. Take it wet and pack it tight and let it cure for 2 days before you judge the warmth. He was quiet for a moment. He said, how much clay? She said, I used 12 buckets. He paused. For a 12 by 16 cabin. Your cabin is larger. He said, 20 buckets. She said, probably. He drank his coffee. He said, Margaret is cold in the mornings. She does not say so, but I know. She said, Margaret is cold because the north wall has gaps, not because your fire is insufficient. He said nothing for a moment. He looked at the fireplace, which was a modest fire maintaining 60 degrees. He said, you are running the fireplace at what rate? She said, 1/3 of what I would burn in the stove. Perhaps less. She paused. The stove was compensating for the chinking. Without the stove, I had to fix the chinking. Fixing the chinking changed what the fireplace needed to do. He said, fixing the chinking is what changed it. She said, yes. He said, not the fireplace. She said, the fireplace was always sufficient. A fireplace is a serious heat source. The problem was never the fireplace. The problem was the wall. He looked at the north wall, the sealed joints, the grey clay cured hard in the cracks. He said, you did this in 1 day. She said, most of it. I went back to the creek twice for more clay. She paused. It takes most of a day for a careful job. He said, I could help, with your cabin or mine. She said, my cabin is done. Come in spring if your creek clay is good, and I'll show you the method properly. Or go home today and look at your north wall, and if what you find there looks like what I described, do it now. Don't wait for spring if your wall is bad. He said, Margaret. She said, yes. If your north wall is what I think it is, Margaret is cold every morning, because every morning the overnight fire has fought a losing battle against the leaks in your wall. A morning fire in a sealed cabin holds heat through the night. A morning fire in a leaky cabin heats the night. He was quiet. He drained his coffee. He stood and put his hat back on and wrapped his scarf. He said, I'm glad you are alive. She said, I wasn't planning otherwise. He said, no. He said it in the way that told her he had been planning for otherwise, that the 3 days had been 3 days of not coming, because he had told himself she was competent, and 3 days of the specific fear that competent was not always enough, and that this morning he had come because Margaret had said go, and he had needed Margaret to say it. He went out. She went to the window and watched him ride east on the valley road, the horse's breath in clouds, the man upright in the saddle, riding back toward the claim that had a leaky north wall and a wife who was cold in the mornings and would, she predicted, have sealed chinking before the end of the week. The temperature outside read -42. Inside it read 60. She sat down in the chair and looked at the north wall and thought about it the way she thought about things that had turned out to contain more information than she had known they contained when she started. The stovepipe failing had been a bad event. The bad event had revealed the chinking problem. The chinking problem, fixed, had produced a cabin that was better than the cabin before the pipe failed, because the original cabin had been compensating for its own deficiency with supplemental heat, and compensating for a deficiency and correcting a deficiency were not the same thing. She had corrected the deficiency. She had needed a stovepipe failure and a -40 cold front to make correcting it the only available option. She thought about this. Then she went and got the notebook she used for the claim records and wrote down what she had done, in Finnish, in the precise account book style that her father had used for the clay work, and that she had learned from him at the table in the Karelia house in the winters of her childhood. She wrote the date of the pipe failure. She wrote the temperature readings from January 2nd through January 5th. She wrote the clay trips, 4 buckets stored, 3 creek trips, 12 buckets total. She wrote the chinking count, north wall 31 gaps, south 19, east 12, west 24, window frames 8 additional, total 94. She wrote the temperature readings, 41 at noon on January 2nd, 35 at 4 when she lit the fireplace, 62 by 8 that evening, 53 at 4 in the morning with minus 45 outside. She wrote 98-degree differential, sealed wall. She wrote fireplace sufficient without compensation. She wrote the wood consumption, 2 days of serious cold, 1/3 of what the stove would have required for the same temperature. She looked at the numbers. The numbers were saying something she had not started out intending to ask. They were saying that the stove, which Paavo had added in 1866 as an improvement, had been compensating for a deficiency rather than representing an improvement. The improvement had been accomplished today, with clay, and the stove, when she got the new collar and repaired it, would be running a cabin that was fundamentally different from the cabin it had been heating before. The sealed cabin would need less from the stove. The stove in a sealed cabin would produce warmth instead of compensating for its absence. She wrote this down. She wrote, "The improvement was never the stove. The improvement is the wall." She closed the notebook. The new collar came from Laramie Creek in the 3rd week of January, carried by the Valley Courier on a route that ran after the cold front broke, and the temperature came back to a manageable minus 12. Peter Vanderbeck, the courier, brought it to the door, and she paid him the 50 cents it had cost and thanked him, and he looked at the cabin, and then at the porch thermometer, and then at her. He said, "You've been here since January 2nd. She said, "Yes." He said, "I thought someone would have come to get you." She said, "I was warm." He said, "At minus 45. She said, "At minus 45. She said it without elaboration, because the elaboration was in the notebook, and the notebook was in Finnish, and Peter Vanderbeck did not read Finnish. He said, "How?" She said, "The chinking." He said, "The chinking." She said, "The cabin was leaking." She re-chinked with river clay when the pipe failed. She sealed the cabin, and the fireplace was sufficient. She said this, the way she said most things, directly, the Finnish way, the way her father had explained clay work at the kitchen table. He looked at the cabin wall. He pressed his hand to the north wall, chinking the way everyone who heard about it pressed their hand to the north wall, chinking. The clay was fully cured now, hard as the logs on either side, grey-pale in the January light. He said, "River clay." She said, "From the tributary bank below the north field. Wet, packed deep, 2 days to cure." He said, "I have a claim on the South Fork. The cabin is cold in the mornings." She said, "Look at your north wall. Look at the 3rd course from the floor." She paused. "Put your eye to the gaps." He said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her wall with the expression she was becoming familiar with, the expression of someone who was doing arithmetic about their own situation. He said, "Can I come back in spring?" She said, "Come in spring. Bring a spade and 2 empty buckets and a day's time." He said he would. He rode on. She installed the new collar herself, which took most of the afternoon because the cast iron was cold, and the fit required patience, and the patience required warming the collar twice over the fireplace fire to get it to seat correctly. She connected the pipe and opened the draft, and started the stove and stood back and watched the smoke go where it was supposed to go, up and out, clean, the stove beginning its work in the sealed cabin. The temperature in the sealed cabin was 61 when she started the stove. By 2 hours, it was 69. she let the stove down to a maintenance level. The sealed cabin with the stove was not the same as the unsealed cabin with the stove had been. The stove in a sealed cabin ran at the maintenance level and produced 69, and she left it there and it stayed there. And she did not need to feed it the way she had been feeding it before January 2nd, the way she had been feeding it for 3 years, without understanding that she was compensating. She went back to the notebook. She wrote the date of the collar installation. She wrote the temperature, 61 before the stove, 69 after 2 hours, maintenance level. She compared the maintenance level to the maintenance level of the previous winters, which she had recorded each January in the same notebook. The fire would tally against the temperature records. The maintenance level was half of what it had been before the rechinking. Half. She sat with this for a moment. She wrote half the fuel, same temperature, sealed wall. She thought about the firewood stacked in the covered shelter, the 6 cord she had laid in for the winter, the 6 cord she had assessed in October as adequate with careful management and the stove operating. She had 4 cord remaining after January's first 3 weeks. At the new maintenance rate, 4 cord would last until late April. She had entered winter planning for careful management and had arrived at surplus. She wrote, 4 cord remaining. January 22nd, surplus. In February, she wrote to Erkki. She wrote in Finnish, as they always corresponded, the Finnish of the Karelia settlement that was different in small ways from the Finnish of the cities, but was the Finnish they both thought in. She wrote about the stovepipe failing and the clay, and the rechinking and the temperature readings, and the wood consumption numbers. She wrote these things in order, the way the notebook had recorded them, date and temperature and action and result. At the end, she wrote, "You told me the winter was the difficulty. You were right that the winter was the difficulty. The difficulty was the wall, not the winter. I fixed the wall in 1 day with river clay and 12 buckets. The winter has been fine since then." She did not write anything else. She sealed the letter and gave it to Peter Vanderbeck on his next courier run and went back to the claim. Erkki wrote back in March. He wrote about the Nebraska winter, which had been hard but manageable, and about the children, and about his claim's progress. At the end he wrote, "I would like to understand the clay method. Explain it to me as you would explain it to a student." She smiled when she read this. She sat down at the writing table and wrote him 4 pages in Finnish, the clay composition and the creek trip method and the gap-finding technique and the curing time and the before and after temperature readings and the wood consumption comparison. She wrote it the way her father had explained clay work at the kitchen table. Start with the material, then the method, then the result, then the reason. She sealed the 4 pages and gave them to Peter. In April, when the Wyoming spring came in its gradual way and the creek bank was accessible without cold weather management, she went to the tributary with Otto Hess and Peter Vanderbeck and a man named Carl Brink, who had heard about the clay method through Peter's courier routes, and who had a claim 12 miles north with a north wall he had been worried about since November. She showed them the bank, the grey-pale clay below the topsoil line, the way to read the bank for the fine particle clay versus the gritty clay that did not seal well. She showed them the spade work, the wet packing, the test press to confirm workability. She showed them how to store it under canvas to keep it workable through a journey back to their claims. Otto had rechinked his own cabin in January, 2 days after his visit, and he confirmed what she had found. Margaret was warm in the mornings for the first time since they had arrived in Wyoming. He said this quietly, standing at the creek bank in April, while she showed Carl Brink the spade work. He said it once to her, not loudly. He said, "She is warm in the mornings." She said yes. He said nothing else. Carl Brink had 23 gaps on his north wall and 6 on his west wall. He knew the count because he had gone home and looked the way she had told him to, pressing his eye to the chinking and counting what admitted daylight. She told him, 29 gaps, 1 day's work. He said, 1 day. She said, 1 careful day. You are not rushing this. You pack it deep and you pack it tight and you go back for more clay if you run short, and you do not stop until the wall is done. He said, I'll need 30 pounds at least. She said, 35. Better to have more than to run short at the east wall. He nodded. She went home to the claim in the April afternoon, the creek bank behind her and the cabin ahead. She had told them what she knew, and she had told it the way her father had told it to her. Start with the material, because the material was the foundation of everything. River clay was different from bank clay because the river did the work of sorting. The river took whatever washed into it and tumbled it, and the heavy particles sank, and the fine particles stayed in suspension, and travelled, and eventually settled in the slow stretches where the creek bent and the velocity dropped. The pale grey clay at the tributary bend below the North Field was the finest clay on the property because the tributary bent there and slowed there, and had been depositing fine particles in that bend for longer than anyone in Wyoming had been in Wyoming. She had told Carl Brink to look for the grey colour. Bank clay was brown or rust from the iron in it. River clay that had been sorted was grey, the grey of fine particles without the coarser material to colour it. Grey meant fine. Fine meant it went into the small cracks. Small cracks were the ones that killed you in January, the ones that were too small to see from across the room, but that admitted air at the velocity of a 90-degree temperature differential. She had shown Peter Vanderbeck the difference between packing deep and packing shallow, the difference in how the clay behaved when it cured. Shallow packing shrank and cracked at the surface and looked sealed and was not sealed. Deep packing shrank internally but maintained the surface seal because there was enough mass behind the surface to hold it. Deep packing meant your thumb went all the way in. If your thumb met resistance before it was fully in, the clay behind was too dry or the gap was too shallow. You wet the clay and tried again. She had told Otto these things in January, and he had re-chinked in 2 days, and Margaret was warm. She told Carl and Peter in April, and hoped they went home and looked at their north walls with the same eye she had used in January, the eye that was looking for the argument rather than the reassurance, the eye that wanted to know what was actually there. The teaching part was not the clay technique. The teaching part was the looking. Most people looked at their cabin walls and saw the wall they had built, the wall they knew, the wall that had sheltered them through previous winters well enough. They did not see the gaps because they were not looking for the gaps. They were looking at the wall, and the wall looked like a wall. She had looked at her own north wall for 5 years and not seen 94 gaps. She had looked at it in January with the specific question, where is the cold coming in? And 94 gaps had answered. The question changed what the eye found. This was the thing she had been teaching for 19 years before she came to Wyoming. The thing she had tried to put into the children in the Karelia classroom who were going to be working in clay beds and timber yards and at sea and in mines, who were going to encounter problems that required looking at what was actually there rather than what they expected to find. The question changes the eye. The eye that is looking for a specific thing finds what is there. The eye that is looking at the general thing finds what it expects. She had pressed her eye to the crack and seen daylight. Once you had seen it, you could not unsee it. Every wall she had looked at since January, she looked at with the eye that was looking for the gaps. She had started to see the walls of every building she entered as what they actually were, a more or less successful barrier between inside and outside, more successful in some places and less in others, with the gaps visible if you pressed your eye to them and looked at the angle that let the light through. The south face of the cabin caught the spring sun as she reached it. The April light warm on the log face, the clay joints pale grey against the dark wood. She pressed her hand to the north wall as she passed it. She pressed her hand to the north wall as she passed it. The clay was warm from the afternoon sun, not 60 degrees, not the thermal mass warmth of the interior wall that faced the fire, the warmth of a sealed surface that had been sitting in the April sun, absorbing what was freely offered. She held her hand there. Her father had pressed his hand to his own clay-chinked wall in Karelia and had said, "The wall knows what it is for." She had been 8 years old, and she had thought it was the kind of thing adults said when they meant something they were not precisely saying. She had spent 32 years occasionally thinking about what he had actually meant. She understood now. The wall knew what it was for. The wall was for holding the inside against the outside. A wall that was sealed did this. A wall that leaked did not do this, regardless of how much wood you put on the fire to compensate, regardless of how good the stove was or how efficient the design. A wall that leaked was not doing what a wall was for. She had sealed the wall. The wall was doing what it was for. The winter was over. The thermometer on the porch post read 41 degrees in the April afternoon. The cabin behind her held whatever warmth the morning fire had put into it, the sealed walls keeping it against the 41-degree afternoon that would drop to 23 tonight. The kind of April night that was still a Wyoming night and required a fire. She would build the fire. She went inside. The notebook was open on the writing table to the page she had been working on, the summary she was writing for anyone who asked, in the account book style her father had taught her and that she had been using to keep the claim records for 5 years. She was not writing it for a newspaper or a report or any audience she could identify. She was writing it because the information was useful, and useful information should be written down in case the person who held it was not always there to give it. She wrote the final entry. The clay is on the tributary bank below the North Field. The gap-finding method is eye to the crack at sunrise, which is when the light shows best. The packing method is thumb deep, index finger to smooth. The curing time is 2 days. The result is a wall that knows what it is for. She read this back. She closed the notebook. She built the fire.